Having served as a mediator, I worked, for example, in one community in Western Washington related to flooding issues, where they've been hit with very serious storms over the last 20 years. More severe and more difficult storms than they'd ever seen before. In some ways very similar to the community here, except for, of course, they can move up land. And so when I look at the community represented here in this film, see a couple of different dynamics at play. One is just very much the community having its back against the wall, or perhaps its feet being washed by the sea and unable to go anywhere else. Think about how they shifted the frame as they were presenting their story from the beginning of saying, hey, we needed help, to really being able to speak from the heart. And again, similar to some of the other communities that I've been able to work with, where the Chehalis Basin that I was talking about, where flooding was a very, very serious issue. It is people speaking from the heart who can actually tell the community's story in a way sometimes to get that help. Now, in the particular community I had the privilege to work in, we had a 5th-generation dairy farmer who stood in tears as he described the water coming up so fast that he had to listen to his cows drown. That's a good way to catch somebody's attention. And similarly, I think the folks in this were able to tell their story and be able to gather, eventually, the help. I also look at this and think about power dynamics. There's lots of kind of power in the world. The power of a story, the power of a narrative, the power of somebody being as stuck as the Carterets are, but also the power and narrative of the conflict that had happened on the mainland, the main island, where they were going to, and ways that those narratives coming together and the different dynamics at play. I think the final thing actually is interesting for me to see was actually the power of a child being involved, the small girl Cornelia, and the effect that she had, again, in humanizing, I think, what is hard otherwise to perhaps understand. What is this thing called climate change? It is, I think, as an individual, very hard to understand that narrative, but to see the face of a child and to understand, I'm feeling so desperate that I need some help here, such that I'm willing to bring a child with and ask for that help, again, has a way of putting, I think, a very real face on this, in a way that hopefully allows them to come. I watched this a little bit ago and actually was very curious to know what happened next. The film was filmed in 2009. And apparently a couple of the families, and so they could perhaps talk more about this, but a couple of the families actually did relocate. And some of them actually then relocated back to the island. But that transition, that request to become part of another community is a very difficult request. And I think one of the ultimate challenges that I think about in terms of handling mediation and dispute resolution and thinking about climate change is that we are all collectively in for a lot of very hard conversations. And we collectively actually don't have a very good skill set for having those conversations. What does it take in every one of our communities to think about how our community might be impacted by how the weather is changing? Somebody used the term the other day, the weirding of weather. Over the last several months, I have read story after story of this was the strongest storm we've ever seen. This is the largest hurricane we've ever seen. This is the biggest flood we have ever seen. In August and September, we had massive floods of record in places like Iran, Japan, the United States, South Carolina, Utah, both within a month. Texas has been in extreme drought right until it was hit by a wall of 38 feet of water. Their reservoirs jumped that much in a day, they went back to drought, they went back to flood. That's very hard for all of us to actually deal with in terms of managing natural resources, managing water, managing our crops, our food, our energy supplies. But in order to actually deal with that kind of shift in the system, I guess the ultimate challenge that I would offer is we all need to be talking about it in very, very concrete ways. Happy to talk further about it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
As a linguist, I must begin by apologizing that when I was asked to talk about this film, I said, oh, I don't think about it. But as time marched on and I got told, okay, this has to be on that particular day, I panicked a bit because this is not the area I normally work in. So I looked around and said to myself, no, let me find somebody who knows much more about this. That's when I dragged Richard Mbih to come with me, because he knows much more about it than I'll ever do. So the question then is, how did we frame our discussions? What is going to happen is this. I'm going to try and provide a general view of what I think the film or the DVD and other general interests about climate change mean. And then to entertain you a bit, my colleague will then try and situate this discussion within Africa. This is founded on the assumption that the best way of understanding what was happening to those communities, the islanders and the mainlanders, is to compare it with other contexts. Because if you are just going to look at one context, you tend to get yourself locked in. So my colleague is going to situate it in Africa, and then we'll have a discussion. As somebody who pretends to be a literary scholar as well, I thought, let me begin with this series. Let me organize my talk around a series of quotations. The first one that I cited here is by John Locke, which he wrote in 1695. And let me read it out to you. It is of great use to the sailor to know the length of his line, though he cannot fathom all the depths of the ocean. Our business here is not to know all things, but those things which concern our conduct. We need not be troubled that some things escape our attention, that some other things escape our knowledge. So why is that interesting as a way of framing our discussion? The discussion to me, and some extent with our colleague, is that there are certain things that we or I don't know about climate change. But I need not necessarily be too much worried about it, because there will always be something that I don't know. Practically, what this means is that we still can be able to do quite a lot, even though our knowledge is what about the whole situation is rather limited. And when you try and situate that within this particular movie, you can see a number of things that these communities might not know. For example, the islanders were not very sure how they were going to be received when they go to the mainland. And to the mainlanders themselves were not very certain how they were going to respond to the presence of this group of islanders. And so the thing that we also don't know very well about this, we don't have a very clear idea, at least I don't, of the internal dynamics within the islanders amongst themselves as they relate to what? To climate change. Because they are not a uniform group. Right? They are likely to respond differently. For example, if you look at the old guy when he's talking about his experiences, right? It's quite clear that he's experiencing issues about climate change slightly different from the other young generation as they go along. Now, let me move on to the second quotation. Not a single problem is solved, but you should satisfy yourself if the problems are correctly presented. That, in a way, it's good that we are engaged in trying to address these issues about climate change and the problems that arise with it. But problems are not easily solved. So, from my perspective and some of the lectures by Alexis Saron, what is important is that the problems are correctly presented. And if you are going to talk about the problems being correctly presented, you will find in this movie a number of different ways in which the problems are presented. For example, the way in which the government, according to this film, provides support to the islanders. The islanders feel that the rice that they've given them, etc., the cost of that rice, for example, they would have managed to be able to buy enough land and to feed themselves. So the tendency from the islanders' perspective is that what you are faced with here is a tendency for government to make people parasitic upon them. So this is, they are presenting the problems very differently. The government's view is slightly different from that of the islanders. Of course, you can then argue that even in government, they present those problems differently. And then if you continue if you move this further, and you can then say perhaps the international community, like all of us here, may be presenting the problems about climate change differently from the perspectives that may be adopted by the islanders and the mainlanders. So the key thing here is not so much the solution, but how we are describing the problems that we are faced with. Quotation, then I'll move on with it. The other quotation that I don't have here says that there are no solutions in life. There are only viable alternatives. So what may be a viable alternative to us today might be very different in future. That is generally the literal presentation about what I was talking about. Now, let me give you what I think is the commentary that I have about this book. One of the things that is quite interesting to me as a linguist about this movie will be the use of terms, in this case of aspects like land, home, the elderly, etc., and aspects about climate, refugees. Let me just take one aspect about land. The islanders say they are interested in finding land, right? But what does land mean within this particular community? My view is that land is sort of saturated with emotion and memory, right? So land in that case might be different from the way I may understand land. Right? And so it is important to understand the degree of saturation of emotions about it. It's not so much how vast it is, but it is the memories that you have about that. So for example, when the elder guy says that you'll be the last to leave, right? You need to be able to understand that he can only lead his life on the basis of the land that he lived on. Right? And then the second thing that comes up, which is very interesting to us, is the issue about the identities of these guys. The initial part, as we go through this, is a distinction between the identities of the islanders and the identities of the mainlanders. And there is a distinction that I'm trying to draw here between strong and weak identities. The strong identities for the islanders is what they're calling that identity that they always have within them, right? Something that is constant irrespective of where they are, whether they're islanders or whether, for example, they are in the mainlanders, what we're calling here the strong identity. Then the weak identities would be those identities that they can shift, right? When they move from defining themselves as islanders to defining themselves as mainlanders and all that. So that identities are very useful. Then the last thing that I want to talk about here are the type of ownership of land. We'll talk about that. Then the last thing, statement that I want to make is another quotation, which comes from this DVD, which says, when you speak about climate change, don't just speak from the head. Meaning that even individuals, the islanders or the mainlanders, they should just not speak from the head. This is not just an intellectual exercise. It is, for some people, what they call practical emotions. So what I hope I was trying to illustrate is the importance of what I'm calling here practical emotions as opposed to benign intellectual experience of the phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here today. When Sinfree, as he told you, sent me an email that I should prepare something a few days ago, it was, to me, I thought, oh, look at this thing coming up from my field and from what I've actually experienced not long ago. Because when I watched the video, the sun come up, the first thing that came to my mind is what my own parents, what I have gone through, and what many of our African communities are still going through, villages are still going through. Then I remember the first thing that when I stepped to the University of Yaoundé in 2003, there was a lecture, and one professor said, there's climate change. I was confused. I didn't know what climate change was really all about. Then he simplified it by giving an example of children. What is happening is that since most of the communities rely on spring water, on maybe small valleys, small swamps, that nowadays you go to those small water ponds, you see children scrambling to carry water, you see big young children, some of them will come in very early in the morning, they line up their containers just to at least get a bit of water to sustain their family. And throughout my research, my graduate research, I decided, after my bachelor's degree and master's degree, I decided to get into this and try to see what is happening. And that is how I get into agro-pastoral land use research, in which I look at I actually get to look at the effects of climate change digitally and some of the factors that are responsible to climate change. I realized that climate change, the whole concept of climate change is something that has been politicized, and and it's a whole institutional issue that those who are actually suffering from it do not even have the opportunity to manage or to actually benefit what is going on. Then some group of people are benefiting from it, while those who really need that support are not benefiting from it. Then I was looking at it, I look at persistent farmer-herder conflicts, communities fighting over land, you see pastoral communities migrating, scrambling over pasture land. So it was really, it's really interesting to look at it, that the fact that climate change is happening in Africa in a different dimension, you can actually look at it in another perspective, the case of rising sea level in the Carteret. Whereas in Africa, we are experiencing, but mostly we also, coastal communities also experience rising sea levels, but most of the sub-Saharan communities are really struggling, and they are struggling with drought, deforestation, and population change. Poverty is just making the whole process so complicated. So in order to reduce my discussion, I look at a few things. I try to look at it in a global context, where I realize that the whole world is actually experiencing climate change, but in different ways. The United States is almost experiencing climate change every day. We hear of Hurricane Katrina, different kinds of earthquakes that are displacing people. But the difference in this case is that when it happens in the United States, people don't really displace because they have abundant land and have the resources to take care of themselves. But when it happens in a place like Africa, it becomes a problem. And that is why you see the United Nations term them environmental refugees, those who are forced to move because of environmental crisis. So this is the same situation with the Carterets. They have no choice. And the funniest thing is that most of this type of people, in most cases, they are kind of being neglected. They don't really give them enough the concern that they need. Whereas they need just minimum attention, minimum support to actually resist where they are moving to. So I went back to, let me go back to Africa. So you look at how Africa, you look at the landscape of Africa, the physical map of Africa actually showing you the different physical characteristics of the region. You see, most of the northern region is characterized by the Sahara Desert. Then as you are coming down, downward towards the tropical regions, you have the Sahelian zones. Then as you are moving down here, you have the tropics, which experience the tropical rainforest. So what is actually happening in these areas? Anyway, as you move southward, you have some of the desert. You have the Kalahari Desert down, then the major desert, which you know is the Sahara Desert. So what is really happening is that as the climate change, things are moving, climate change or global warming is increasing every day. Environmental degradation is having different phases, drought, deforestation, then coupled with the increasing population in the region, lack of resources, acute poverty, conflict, the whole situation is really crazy that it's difficult to explain. And most of the attempts that are being used to address some of these issues, in most cases, instead help in displacing people more and causing more misery in the region. Then I remember the case of the Nubians in the early 90s. So the Nubians settled around the Nile River in Egypt. Sorry, I wasn't very clear here. Around the Nile River in Egypt, and because the Nile River was increasing, because of the persistent floods around the Nile River, some of the communities had to actually displaced, move to other areas. But when NASA came to power and decided to construct the Aswan Highland, they had no choice. Some of them were forcibly displaced. So in some of those situations, just imagine how many of them actually suffered the destruction of their cultures, the beautiful monuments that they had, and up to date, most of them are still struggling to go back to their origin. So just look at the Carteret. You see, I almost wept when I saw the old man saying that he would be the last person to leave that place. That is where he was born. His ancestors are all there. That is where most of those communities, they believe in culture, in rituals. So moving into another region, into a new place, we start facing the problem of acceptance, integration, cultural shocks, things like that. It becomes very, very difficult to understand. And I also look at another example, the case of the Darfur region in Sudan, which is located, you see this other map is actually differentiates the desert areas, the Sahelian zones, and the tropical zones. So Sudan is somewhere around here. So we look at it, this other stretch, the darker yellow, actually stretch from Senegal to the Sudan, indicating that some of that areas, most of the environment is degraded. Even though it's degraded, we have a bit of pasture in those areas. So what is happening is that as the area is degrading more and more due to climate change that is affecting it, deforestation, and as the Sahara Desert is expanding, because according to geologists or researchers, the Sahara Desert is expanding at least 1 mile a year, which is a major problem. So they are also expecting, they also believe that rainfall is equally declining about 30%, has declined about 30% over 40 years, which is a major problem. And that is a major problem in sub-Saharan Africa today, which really needs to be addressed. And as they attempt moving southward, they are facing clashes with different communities that they come together because they make most of those who live within those Sahelian regions are pastoralists, while those around the sub-Saharan, the sub-humid regions are farmers. So now you see the persistent conflict between those farmers and the pastoralists. And the case of let's look at the case in the Darfur region in Sudan, where the Darfur crisis is, the Nuba people are threatening to restart the Darfur crisis because they believe that the Arabs, which they accepted them from the northern part of Darfur are mostly the Arabs, then the southern are other local tribes. So they believe that the Darfur, the Arab nomads from the northern part of Darfur that are migrating southward into the Nuba tribes, grazing their animals, are going beyond their bounds because they are now cutting trees, things that they are trying to instead preserve in order to at least control climate change in those regions. And the United Nations Environmental Program predicts that if such a conflict happens, it will have serious negative repercussions in almost the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, as more than 70% of crop yields will drop in the region. And if it happens in that way, there will be a serious problem. Just look at how the region is and the number of countries that surround it. So if conflicts break out in these areas, it will become very difficult to actually address. And it brings to mind again, I remember again the fact that Central African Republic that is located here is located east of Cameroon, East Cameroon. And what is happening here in the Central African Republic is a landlocked country. So most of their food here is coming from Cameroon. So when I was in Cameroon in 2013 for my field, what happened was that the rebels that were there, they were always living there. During the day, they crossed the borders and come and drink in Cameroon. So the major roads that leave Cameroon linking the Central African Republic that transports most food from Cameroon into their regions because they have experienced a lot of conflicts and they don't have food. So what happened was one of the rebels killed a police commissioner, a Cameroonian police commissioner. What happened? Cameroonians were so upset they blocked the roads, and before you know it, there was no food in Central African Republic. So many Central African Republic citizens now were now crossing the borders and coming, actually migrating just because they didn't have food and because they stopped transportation there for a month. So it becomes so complicated when it comes to climate change. And it's very interesting. It's a very interesting topic. Each day you talk of climate change with multiple dimensional phases. Every day it has contributed to, it contributes to conflicts, to most of the conflicts in Africa. It's contributing to drought, it's contributing to food insecurity, and it's a serious thing that we actually need to look at seriously. Thank you.